Hello. So today I'm going to talk about priority hints and the path we took to testing them out and deploying them in production. But it's a fairly new feature. So until recently, this has been something that your browser hasn't known about yet. So as a brief agenda, I'm going to be covering priority hints, why we want them, what they are, how they help, and how quickly they've been getting adopted. From there, I'm going to also dig into the origin trial process, which we use to test priority hints and help them become a Chrome feature. We get a little bit into how we use origin trials and how you apply them, and then what happens afterwards in the process. And then lastly, a bit of confirmation on just how much we found that testing these sorts of performance wins built enthusiasm in product teams at Etsy, which is always really exciting to see. And down in the bottom left is the Code is Craft and Etsy engineering blog post that this talk is based off of. So, brief bit about me. As Mel mentioned, I'm a senior web performance engineer at Etsy. I've been there for just over a year, previously with Real Self. Been in web performance for about 4 years, starting with the Perf Matter conference and the Google SEO change with some help from Estelle Whale and Tim Cadlick. I'm based in Seattle in the Pacific Northwest, and there's some of my social links if you want to look me up later. If you've been following me, a lot of this talk may seem familiar. The one oddity might be there are less otters than you might see on my rest of my social media. That said, we do have one otter. After all, it's a significant otter. So, why priority hints? In brief, largest contentful paint. There are other uses for priority hints, but the foremost and easiest to apply use of priority hints is all about largest contentful paint. As a brief background, it is one of three metrics that Google has currently identified as being part of their core web vitals, which they use to influence search rankings, but they also believe are some of the most universally applicable metrics to follow to measure user experience. And on our listing pages before all this, we were hovering at around 2,300 milliseconds at P75, 75th percentile. And as you can see, that's still in the good range as Google sees it, but not by much. 200 milliseconds goes by really quickly. And if we look down below there, we have what is probably familiar, the look of a web page test waterfall example for the page. So this is using a Moto G4 on a 3G connection, since we don't want to be testing the fastest devices, but instead something that's more broadly applicable. And this probably might look a little familiar. Half a second in SSL connection, 1.6 seconds in total to get the main HTML. The first two CSS files load in fairly quickly. The first three JavaScript files load in also pretty promptly. And basically, as soon as possible, that request number 7 is the largest contentful paint image for this page. But it takes until almost 5.5 seconds under these constrained network conditions for largest contentful paint to happen. Less than ideal. But there's not a whole lot going on up above there, and that might make it a little hard for us to improve otherwise. So some might ask, why not preload the image? And that has worked historically, but it has some pitfalls. You have to maintain the preload link separately in the source file, which means that it can be brittle and fall out of sync, which leads to wasted downloads as the browser preloads an image, then finds out it doesn't need it, and then has to re-download it again. And it's still vulnerable to the browser deprioritizing that image if it doesn't know that it's within the viewport, which we'll get into a little bit more about why that matters in a moment. Also, even worse going forward, it gets really complicated to make sure that preloading works reliably for responsive images, and it gets more complicated if you're trying to selectively use modern image formats as browsers gain support for new image formats with better compression. So, priority hints. Let's look at what they look like in action and get a sense of what they do and why you might want to apply them. So, up top here, we see 3 ways of applying priority hints. It's at its most simple, It's taking an image tag and adding the fetch priority equals attribute to it. By default, there's auto, or what happens if you don't apply fetch priority at all, as well as high and low. It's not just good for images either. You can use it on iframes, which can be neat if you're using those. And you can also apply that to fetch requests in case you're trying to load something in programmatically. And below that, we have the Chrome prioritization graph, where we see how the browsing engine uses its heuristics to try and find what content should be loaded most quickly. There's two phases to the initial load. There's the layout blocking phase, and then the conditional loading one at a time phase. The main resource, the HTML, is of course the highest priority and the most render blocking. You really can't get anywhere loading a page without that. Then next we have images and media, audio, video, etc. And that's low by default. It's not going to load in the layout blocking phase because at that point the browser doesn't know if that image is important or not. Once the browser has gone through the rendering step and has a sense of the layout of a page, it can detect if an image is within the viewport and then will bump it up to a high priority, but that's often too late for the image to load much quicker. CSS loads in render blocking mode, but only until the first non-preloaded image. Once that first image request comes in, the browser then figures that layout blocking is more or less over, and it can bump future CSS down in priority. Similarly, JavaScript loads in high priority before any image requests because it assumes those are render blocking and are critical for laying out a page. But once an image request comes in, it gets bumped back, and then async and defer gets loaded even lower down. But if you attach fetch priority high to any of these attributes, you can see a pretty consistent bump. Most notably for Largest Contentful Paint, images go from low priority to be bumped up later to high priority right off the bat. This is non-render blocking too, and lets the browser preload parser just immediately get at loading that image, which is very valuable. Beyond that, if it's already at high priority, it can't really be bumped up much higher. CSS, however, late loading CSS can be bumped up, which can be useful, as well as scripts. This can be handy in case you have, for example, a script that you want to load asynchronously, but when it reaches time for that script to be loaded, then bump it up in priority. Alternately, you can bump something down in priority, which can be pretty neat for, say, lazy loaded images or non-essential scripts. You can take some of that CSS and script logic and bump it back. Through careful selection, you can give enough hints to the browser that it will load much faster. So to put it all together, this is what the graph looks like in total. It's a little bit complicated, but you can kind of see some patterns emerge as far as high priority bumps it up to high if possible, low priority bumps it down to low if possible. Now, it's important to remember also that these are just hints to the browser. They will generally try and follow them, but they are not required to. So let's look at what this did. On the right, we have that same web page test waterfall graph that we saw. And below we see that same page with priority hints applied. Now, rather significantly, that image request number 7 gets bumped up to be request number 4. It loads while the HTML is still downloading, which saves almost half a second on its own in that case, and bumps it up above the JavaScript, which is also useful, and rather significantly, it bumps it up above the other images that are otherwise competing for download time. So in that particular case, we could see multiple seconds of improvement, and in fact, the worse the connection and the worse the device, the more of a benefit can be gained from this, which is wonderful to see. Overall, we saw an 83 millisecond improvement in Largest Contentful Paint just across all page types and all device types and all network types. That's a solid 4% improvement, and that translated to about 1 to 2 months of gains above and beyond the work that we were already doing, which is really nice. Once you've gone through all of the easy optimizations, then getting out that extra 4% here and there can really matter. And all it took was one new template attribute, which is, again, really nice. So how has the uptake been across the web since this became a feature? As of October, one bit over 1.5% of all page loads in Chrome are detecting priority hint usage, which is really neat. However, across all of the sites observed by the HTTP archive, only 0.03% of sites are applying it to their large contentful paint image, which is really small, but it is a new feature. These sorts of adoptions take time. But rather significantly, the top 1,000 and top 10,000 sites, according to the HTTP archive, 4% of them are already using this for large contentful paint. So if you're trying to look at what the top sites are doing to improve that very important initial page load experience, priority hints are a good spot to start. So to quote Rick Viscomi, a staff DevRel engineer over at Google, priority hints is like a cheat code for improving largest contentful paint by helping the image load sooner. That so few sites are using it demonstrates one of the biggest and easiest performance opportunities before us. And I strongly co-sign this sentiment. It's really easy to apply, but not many sites are applying it yet, which means that if you're able to apply it, that is a little bit of an advantage. So now that we've worked through why they're useful, let's actually look a little bit into how they became a Chrome feature to begin with, and how they're getting into the HTML and CSS fetch spec, origin trials. So origin trials are a way for Chrome-based browsers to test out features and allow developers to test out new features without some of the pitfalls that have come from previous ways of testing experimental APIs. It ends up being pretty simple to apply. You sign up with a form, you get a token that applies to your domain, and then you add it as a meta tag in your HTML head, which pretty nice, pretty simple. That's actually where we started. We did learn midway through, though, that most of the time that's all you need, but because the priority hint trial was interacting with the preload parser, that actually wasn't fast enough. By the time the browser engine had dug through, found the origin trial, figured out what it meant, and applied the rule change, it was already blazing past the priority hint attribute itself. So instead, we had to switch to sending it as part of the initial HTTP header. And once we figured that out, it was really straightforward from there. And then lastly, there's also doing it programmatically in JavaScript, which is useful if you're doing third-party origin trials in particular. And then from there, the process is also pretty straightforward. We tested and provided feedback to Google. The feedback was aggregated, and 98% of 75 testers were likely to keep using it. The feedback was submitted to the W3C tag group. Tag group was satisfied by it, and the attribute got renamed along the way. Chrome shipped the feature. The working group is now waiting on a second browser engine. Firefox is interested but has not implemented it yet. But once a second browser engine adopts it, then the HTML and JavaScript fetch specs will be updated to include this feature. And to circle back to that, that's 75 testers that were enough to make the difference on whether or not this became a feature or not. The aggregated feedback only had a couple pieces of direct feedback. So really, the more developers are able to interact with the origin trial, the more your voice can be heard. And that's not a whole lot of other voices that you're speaking with, which means that you can have a pretty big impact on the future of the web just by adding a few attributes and being willing to see what's new and what's coming up. And lastly, the product enthusiasm. When we rolled this out and were able to demonstrate a clear performance improvement with no business cost, product teams started paying attention. Since then, if you go on Etsy, search listing cards now use priority hints. The mobile web market page now uses priority hints. Category pages for items now use priority hints, and I didn't have to do all of those myself. When you build that sort of enthusiasm by being able to show clear improvements and effective ones for the amount of effort involved, teams start paying attention and people get enthusiastic about it, which is really exciting to see. So, in closing, priority hints. They're pretty great, and I would really recommend testing them out. Thank you.
Awesome. This priority hints clearly are an amazing feature. I mean, obviously, Mel and I knew about it because we are on the same team with David. But at the same time, it's a really great thing to implement. I actually have a question, and folks, if you have any questions for David right now, feel free to post them in the chat. But I do have a question for you already. What makes it such an amazing, like such a quick win? What does it like? We had many other things. Like, I mean, you mentioned the pitfalls with preload, but what makes this one such an amazing solution?
Sure. So the reason that this was able to be such an easy improvement for Largest Contentful Paint in particular is partially how the browser has to deprioritize images until it can figure out whether it's in the viewport. So sidestepping that alone is pretty good. But it also lets the browser start downloading that image before having to wait for the entirety of the HTML and CSS to download to find out whether it should download it or not. So combining those, it works pretty well. And then pretty much all of the issues that I noted with preload get flipped on their head. Instead of it being two separate tags that you have to maintain and make sure they stay in sync, it's one image that you keep an attribute on, and then the browser handles the rest. And that means that responsive images are no longer an issue because the browser is already figuring out which version of a responsive image it wants to download, and it can handle it. And similarly, any new image formats, the browser is able to handle that. And because you're giving up a bit of the control, so you're not telling the browser you must preload this, but instead letting the updated priority do the rest, the browser can handle a lot more of what would otherwise have to be manually specified, which is pretty exciting.
Awesome. And then
get into some of the chat questions, it looks like.
Yeah, so I can relay some of the chat questions to you, and folks, yeah, keep them coming. So the first one that we have is from Brenda Malone. So is there a limit of how many priority hints of high to load?
I don't believe there's a hard cap, but the more, if everything is bumped up to high priority, then they start to contend with each other again, and you kind of can fall back into where you were before. So I would say to really try and keep it minimal. I don't think there is a strict limit right now, but that's something we're testing how it would go would be beneficial. But if you can, I've been finding the most benefit from picking one item in particular to bump up to high, and then bumping more images down to low, for example, so that way what's left in the middle can be bumped up as well. So I think that's where it's easy to think of priority hints as just bumping something up in priority, but sometimes moving something down in priority can also be powerful in its own way.
Cool. Yeah, definitely makes sense. The next question we have is from Kira Ada. So do you know if mobile browsers have different behavior when it comes to priority hints?
I don't know off the top of my head if they definitely do currently. They have in the past, and that's something that browsers have been experimenting with over time. For example, up until about March, I want to say, Chrome on Android did change its priority when the save data header was applied. but they turned that off due to that header not getting much adoption. But mobile browsers do have the option to change their priority around. And honestly, that's something I kind of like about it is, again, you're giving up a little bit of control to the browser, but that also lets the user have more room to potentially specify what their desired behavior would be.
Makes sense. And then our next question is from Russell Patrick Brown. Are these hints problematic for slow internet speeds, or do mobile devices, for example, ignore the hint?
I don't believe they ignore the hint overall, although, again, this is limited to Chrome and Chrome-based browsers at this point, so Firefox ignores them, and Safari ignores them. And as far as internet speeds go, there is the possibility of them causing an issue if, for example, you bump something up in priority above something else that is essential. So if you, for example, with the web page test waterfalls that I showed earlier, if those JavaScript files were in fact critical to render the page at all, then that may have been counterproductive for us. But because those JavaScript files were not essential to initial page rendering, then it wasn't an issue. So I think there's a certain amount of testing that does need to be done to make sure that you're not falling into a position where the hints can be counterproductive. But in general, I haven't found them to be a particular issue for slow internet speeds. If anything, they help slow browsers prioritize what's important to getting that initial page rendering, which ends up being more important for slow devices and slow internet speeds.
I actually have one more question. I remember that when we looked at preloads versus priority hints, there was beyond the question of how hard it is to pick the right resource and all of the challenges that you highlighted, I feel there was something else that effectively made priority hints more effective. It's the fact that during that very early stage of the load, it's the only way to prioritize your a resource like an image to be right next to your CSS file. Do you know any more detail about that?
Yeah. So going back to the loadout charts, I believe that's something where preload wasn't displayed on this chart on its own, but it's still something that was fairly limited, and I believe was also counterproductive because of what I was mentioning with the before image requests and after image requests delineation, where an image being preloaded could set off side effects as far as what prioritization would go where. So yes, that was another case of preload being useful, but a bit more brittle when it comes to getting an image up as close to the CSS as possible.
Cool. And then taking a look at the next question, we have, with regards to fostering product enthusiasm for performance, how is product able to perceive the benefits of priority hints?
Sure. So this is something that as a team we've been working on, is how to communicate performance improvements and performance tests to product teams. And that's kind of been something that we've been working on through a few different approaches. One of the big ones is that all of our product teams, like Etsy, uses a lot of A/B testing. We do a lot of incremental tests to try and see the impact of various code changes, and performance is a part of that, which means that we were able to pretty quickly show an improvement on our test, and then also future tests were able to see that rolling forward as far as how the performance goes. And then we have monthly roll-ups where we're able to look at our performance across a range of metrics and across a range of page types. So that way we could say, for example, with this test, listing pages saw a benefit in Largest Contentful Paint by -83 milliseconds. And then that became the baseline for them to be able to use and then roll forward. So I think a lot of that is less technical and is a little more social as far as us trying to figure out how best to communicate with product teams. But the more we've been able to communicate those wins, the more excited they've gotten, I'd say. So now at this point, we actually aren't running into too much trouble trying to get attention. Product teams love to hear about performance wins, which is a good spot to be in.
And I would say they also appreciate how easy it is to add one attribute to an image tag in their template, right? Like because ROI is always the investment is always a question in the ROI conversation. I see Brenda is asking about prefetch, preload, preconnect being not as great as fetch priority. How do you? Is that true statement overall?
Yeah, I mean, I believe that so prefetch, I think has been I wouldn't say has been abandoned, but I think seems like it's been talked about less within the web performance community. I think because the benefit from the fetch has been a little bit lessened. And I think, remember, prefetch, I want to say, is most useful for second page loads where you're looking into future pages, although I have to pull up documentation to be sure. Preload does have the benefit of better browser support. I believe all current Evergreen browsers support preload. So if you're looking for the widest range of support, you might still need to stick with preload. But they do as Henri notes, they combine just fine. You can actually preload and preconnect. If the preload breaks, the browser will still give you some warnings. There's no getting around that, but you can apply them just fine. And to kind of fall into the next question, we're actually just we currently just let this run as progressive enhancement effectively. Browsers that don't support priority hints just ignore the attribute and they fall back to the behavior as it was before. I believe that we've actually turned off preload on most pages that we were testing it on because kind of the brittleness was tricky, especially on some pages where, for example, on a search page, if you have an entire row of images, being sure which one is the first image might not be as easy to preemptively recommend as it would like to be. So really, I think it ends up being kind of a bit of a trade-off right now where we're still in this intermediate point, but I'm really hoping that Firefox and Safari pick up this feature because the benefit to users is pretty clear and it's very lightweight on developers. So I'm really hoping that it gets into the full spec shortly.
Yeah, I also want to add that preload specifically, we on our website had a pretty good situation where most of our images were discovered at the appropriate time, right? For you in your use case, maybe you have images that are loaded much later and it's harder to pull them up, right? The browser does not discover them, in which case both preload and priority hints will be great tool. In our case, the win with preload was not as great, right? While priority hint pushes that even farther, right? Like moving the image all the way to in parallel with CSS, which was like that extra step that we went with, right? So, like not as Henri mentions in the comments, it's probably like you can combine them together, right? And nothing is just like, hey, the rest of them go away. This one is good now, right? Like that's not necessarily the case. And obviously, pre-connect is a little different story to begin with, right? So it pre-connects to the whole domain, which is has other uses. I would say.
Actually,
Go ahead, Mel. Sorry.
Oh, I actually have a question. That's just something that I think about a lot when talking about kind of this overarching umbrella of, I guess let's call it resource priority. So that would be like priority hints, preload, etc. Like this idea that whenever you prioritize something, theoretically something else is getting deprioritized. So I guess my question for you, David, is like, did you find that in your work? And if so, like, how did you work around that? And also, do you have any thoughts about this idea in terms of priority hints?
Sure. So you're definitely not wrong that bumping something up in priority can cause other items to be deprioritized, but I think generally, so far as what I've seen, the browser heuristics are pretty good at trying to avoid that. If we look at the web page test comparison here, you could say that bumping the Largest Contentful Paint image up bumped the JavaScript down, but if you look at about where the gaps are in loading, the JavaScript is loading at about the same time, just under 2 seconds in either case, and so it's not so much getting slowed down there. Similarly, you could say that the other images would be bumped or would be loading a little bit slower, since the image is loading in its entirety before other images do. But in this case, it's not doing too badly on that front. At most, you see that image number 10 there has a bit more wait time, but that's one that we were all right with trading because, well, it doesn't need to be bumped up. If it were, then we might have tried applying the fetch priority to that image instead. So I think that's something where, back to one of the earlier questions about the limits on how many elements to apply the high priority to, that I think that's where that could come in. If you bump everything up to high priority, then there would be contention, then there could be an issue. But at the end of the day, you still definitely need to test these things. I wouldn't want to deploy something like this without checking to see what it looks like before and after. This one's pretty safe as a feature to roll out, but there's no substitute for testing.